the Allies managed to win the initiative here, and both sides have a fair number of chits in the pool. 4 for the Allies, 3 for the French, so it's actually 3-3 at this point. They march forward with Hesse Castle, and largely are routed, but also drive the French infantry off the guns. There's one inconsequential little fight that happened here over those rounds of fire combat. This is really a twisted situation with Merode splitting his command, half of it going this way, and his command probably absorbed some of General A's force here. I gotta get another divide here. I've got. Let's steal this one. I need that one too, but basically everything on this side is stuff that Merode's already moved. And he's also lined up down here. Now he's going to take command of the village and over. I think, yeah, that's going to be westward. We actually have a compass rose up here. Really sucks when you don't have one at all unless the terrain is obvious, like, you know, Europe. Okay, so like all of Europe, I mean, or the United States. We have him kind of trailing down a command down that way with the intention of then shifting General A over here. Now, General A is not as good as Merode, but it doesn't really matter if I'm going to be assigning chits. And that's going to get me about halfway, maybe a little further, if I unwind these, towards covering the whole line. Now, what it means is I'm out of reserves, except maybe if I want to detach these guys, but all I've got in front of them is some cav that I don't know if it's sufficient to hold the line. Of course, Württemberg and Fugger have not been doing well. Fugger's especially buggered, because if he announces an advance operation to try to attack against Danko, he has to hit the river line too. He got too close to it. So he's got to really take an activity to try to reform so that he's facing that way. But if he does that, then it's possible the Bavarians will come out against him. So he's kind of pinned in place there. And in fact, I got Ratsu, who pulled his way through the swamp, and I feel like I'm wasting time just slogging through the swamp with horses for no really good reason. But as this left flank gets weaker and weaker, at some point something should be able to, you know, there should be enough pressure off Württemberg and off Ratsu and Fugger that we should be able to roll up against it and at least hit sort of the core defensive section rather than this weird screen that I've got in the way, with horses facing the wrong way, mind you. And then here it looks like the French have largely won. I may need to keep Bansac infantry in a position to deal with Churchill if need be. There's sort of a gap here in both sides that could be exploited, where I've got like this mess of French cav, but I'm trying to limit that gap as much as possible and make it painful to try to exploit it. Churchill's cav over here draws sabers and makes another charge, and it was much more effective this time. You can see there's routed units, there's quite a few destroyed French units, but they're still not in great shape. I mean, this unit is kind of wrecked, another one's routed up here. It's painful to do these real full tilt charges, but they can be effective and very powerful, especially driving the French through this marshy river or stream that just screws with, unless they're at the exact right movement point allowance and whatever, and the units that are behind them are at the right distance, it's going to cause real problems. And in this case it did. They had enough movement to fall back to here and then not enough to cross. They took an extra hit from that each, and bang, they're dead. I don't like how the system works. I have the feeling you're going to be creating these kind of weird sort of situations where you're counting how many movement points it's going to cost you to get to the stream and crap like that. I guess if you don't do that, if you just kind of take the effects of the route rules as sort of a random effect, it's fine, and that's kind of how I'm doing it. But I could definitely see wanting to optimize my retreats, and you'll start down a path of horrible types of thinking doing. Limbs are finished out with some delaying action. First over here, Blenville does some cav strikes. Some mixed attacks here and here. This guy was stationary, actually. And then a carousel here against the swamp, because I don't really want to be in it. I can charge it, but there's penalties for doing so. Overall, pretty effective. I drove off one unit, reduced the other at cost to myself. The English artillery, not aiming at the village where I draw counter battery fire, so instead I'm pounding this guy. He's getting flank attacked. Now, the flanks here are only +1. The original, I think, no, okay. I thought maybe it had, I seem to remember something being an advantage to hitting someone in the flank as opposed to the rear. It may be, I don't remember precisely. It may still be kicking around somewhere else. But it would have made sense with artillery or fire going through the flank rather than from the rear, although fire on the rear is going to be very disordering. Especially artillery fire going down the line of the unit could cause a lot of damage, more than usual. So I could have understood if it had been on the fire table. But I think it was somewhere else, maybe on the shock table, or who knows. The artillery over here managed to drive back most of Clarenbolt's troops, and that's going to reduce any effect that he has in terms of being able to push forward. Of course, Orkney's not in great shape either, sitting there alone on one unit. Things have pretty much devolved into kind of armed masses near each other, but not really fighting in a lot of cases. At least in terms of having any effect on the play of the game. The fire is maybe too ragged from units that are out of command or something. I have no idea how to justify the command rules for this, except that you really want to keep your lines together. But it's hard to do so, and they end up getting broken, and they end up not firing because of that. So, both sides just sitting across from each other with no action really being taken anywhere on that side of the field. I'm not sure how much I believe that. I understand there's attempts to try to improve on, the old-fashioned, hey, you can move everything idea. Just not sure, although there's some really neat ideas here with the you draw a chit to see how many chits you put in the cup. I'm not sure how much it's actually working out properly in practice. It feels like, it's throwing a different set of problems out. I'm watching a movie on fiction, but based on Peter the Great. And I can't watch it because I can't use my computer because it's putting together the movies. I like to take more breaks than I've been taking. But anyway, went through the no limbs phase. And notable things, Clarenbolt, I got no idea what the missing letters are there, so I'm making it up, rallied his forces. That's pretty notable because he had a lot of routed stuff. He was able to, get a lot of effect out of saying, okay, I'm just going to pause here and reform the main force of my army. And now he's got quite a lot of army facing, just the artillery. But the artillery's been kind of problematic, at least when there's been some infantry to slow things up in the front, even though they got driven back. Cuts moved forward into place, so we might have another wave of charges here on this kind of weak spot here. Over here, Inglesby, launched an assault as well, and that was not with terribly good effect. He ran into here, got flank hit. This was facing this way, but you're allowed to reposition as you get moved into. And then some fire here didn't really do much. This poor unit took a lot of hits. It went from fairly healthy unit to damaged, but on the other hand, the English had a unit routed. Fugger managed to withdraw to a range where next turn he can launch an assault against Daco. And then I guess we'll do the out of command phase and all kind of die rolling and stuff. We'll probably finish this up tonight. It's getting late, but I wasn't sure I was going to get through this turn. A lot of crap cleared off the field, as you can see here. Unfortunately, the points were high enough to drive the Anglo-Dutch way over their limit, and that is the end of the game. If it wasn't so late, if I really wanted to explore it, I would try to look at what a withdrawal would look like. I think withdrawal is fairly easy in this game, though. And in the sense that it's hard to move your units out at any rapid speed, but it's very easy if you get a command to disengage from battle. Yes, you exchange some fire, but you get to back right up. And then once you've done that, again, if you get a command, you can swing around and move out. Do I feel like the army, though, is routing? If that's the case, then, and I think it is, then it wouldn't be that trivial. And that becomes kind of the problem. How do you represent that in this game, you know? Do you just give a morale penalty to everything and a general attempt to withdraw? And if you give a morale penalty, well, then a lot of units will end up routing, and those can be chased down. That's probably where I would go with this. And again, if I was really excited about playing that out at this point, I would be kind of intrigued to do so, just to see how the mechanisms that I'd invent would work there. I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to do that. I've been posting a lot of videos recently, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the turn forward and leave that opportunity open, make the decision tomorrow. As to a wrap for the battle, damn, I don't know what I did wrong. You know, I'm just learning to use the units. It feels like the English are going to have a really hard time in this battle, though. They are outnumbered. They aren't outled, but how do you make tremendous use of that leadership? I think what you got to do, obviously there's a little bit more time available. Well, only to here. So I think what you've got to do is look at the French, let the French use the free setup. Let the French set up first. They have to. Find their weak spots, set up and deploy to take advantage of those. I don't feel like the initial setup that I had terribly had the English in a position to take advantage of the French. The problem, though, is these bogs. If the English are going to attack, and they must, in order to get some pieces across the river, the Nebelbach, well, then they have to start their way across the bogs, and it gives a big telegraphic move to the French. So then it becomes kind of a reaction game. Can the French react in time to the weak spots that you've identified and launch to try to take advantage of? Because the board is big enough that you can't cover it with French infantry. And the cav we've seen is a little shaky comparatively. The English cav isn't very good on defense for obvious reasons. I think the French is actually better with the carousels. But it can be really, really potent when it hits with that major charge. So I think that's kind of the lines that we're looking at. I am tempted to play out at least another turn, not, of the withdrawal, to see how easily the English have of pulling their army out of here safely. I'll probably do it as a general impetus to move off board and maybe a +1 morale penalty to all units. No rights to to launch an assault or anything like that. Just not everything turns and routes, which if that were to happen, the French cav would destroy everything. And I don't think that's indicative of the era, to tell you the truth. Okay, so I think I'm gonna do a little bit of a post-game round. I thought I saw a shadow butterfly go by. Anyway, I don't know much about the routes of the era, so it's kind of hard for me to do anything reasonable. I would much rather designers supply me with, some tools towards covering that. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the command point chits and successful rolls to allow for a controlled retreat. And any units that don't have that are going to have to break the regiment, the battalion, whatever, in the sense that they suffer the worst withdrawal fire and try to leave as quickly as possible. Nobody's going to be standing around once the retreat order's out. The question is how controlled it's going to be. And when I look at the French got one command to activate. They won the initiative though, and they used Blenheim too far away for the most part to actually engage the enemy. And this is going to be the problem. The nature of a battle is not the same as the nature of a rout. It needs more rules changes, and I think we're going to see that very quickly. And this is why I generally don't play out routes in games, because the designer doesn't provide enough information, enough of his understanding of the design and what it's intended to convey. And I'm usually most interested when I'm first looking at a system to see if it can handle one reasonably well. As I get used to a system, I stop paying as much attention. So I think what we're going to see is that the nature of the rules here are such that you can't actually pursue. And there was a serious rout after Blenheim. Alright, well, I'll keep going with this and see if I see anything that looks like it's going to work for this system in terms of handling routes. For the selected chits, the artillery was the first thing that came up. Limbers. Had to use a chit to get that off the board. And then elsewhere I'm using it to try to get as many engaged units as I can out of their engaged situation. So Württemberg had some engaged units. He kind of fared badly in the fire there. Likewise over here with Hesse Castle and Inglesby, both kind of turning their troops and moving at full rate for most of them and using the non-broken withdrawal. The only person doing any covering is Fugger. The cav is very good at covering because it can move it about at almost the same rate as the infantry, but keep facing the enemy by turning around, by doing 2 turns, essentially, in the battle. I've got some units that were out of command, and they're going to be in trouble. They're going to have to do the break the regiment when we handle the out of command. And another rule to the route, to the army route, which is any units that fail their in command role, where they're operating kind of fully rationally, drop down to disordered status. I'm not going to hit them further than that. See, the problem is if you give them more than that, the entire army just dissolves no matter what, because any units that don't get an in command role or an in command chip pick will start taking casualties or route off the map, and they'll go into the dead pile. And what does the dead pile represent? It represents disorganized units. How much of the army is just gonna collapse here? How much isn't? Should there be maybe a morale check instead for each turn? That might make more sense. Each unit that's activated when it's not in command would have to make a morale check. I think that's what I'm going to do instead, actually, because that way, that fits the game's design, which is make the player roll as many dice as possible. But it also allows for that deterioration to be recorded, essentially, to be variable, and to be apparent to the players as well, without, some kind of just, well, everything's disordered, so if you catch it, it's going to be worse hurt. No, units actually fall apart when they're routing, if nobody's facing them even. And that's something that I should probably keep in mind. Okay, after the no limbs phase, we're seeing the French forces, some of them are engaging, some of them cannot. So, for example, Darko got an engagement. He used his hussars to wipe out a couple routed units. Up here, General A got a command, and you can see his command is kind of scattered now. That brings up an interesting question. When you're in the middle of a pursuit, you don't keep up the same lines of command, yet you keep moving. How much sense does that make? Well, maybe not terribly much. Maybe the command starts disintegrating for the rear units, and they start scavenging instead of really charging forward. Again, that's not going to follow for all things. So, as you can see, thoughts that start to come to mind, it starts to become apparent why this isn't included in games. Because we're talking about probably a couple of pages of rules to handle routes. Now, that's not worth it if it's a standalone game. But to me, at least as a supplement to the game that could be provided, I don't know, either in a magazine like a C3I or something like that, or just somebody making an online supplement would work. Now, of course, my worry is always, but this goes with all of wargaming, that the designers really aren't that much more clever than I am, nor dedicated. I don't believe this in most cases, but in some games I see that. So, for example, what I'm doing here is probably about the extent of design work that I would do, right, for a game. I would play it and say, well, how does it feel? What do I feel? Okay. And that's why I don't feel at all adequate to ever do some kind of historical game. Although maybe at some high level I could get away with it, because I don't feel like something like Empires in Arms, for example, terribly carefully looks at those firepower tables and says, yes, this is the results. You can look at a few numbers and say they come out about right regularly. We're seeing about what we're seeing. But to come up with a tactical system with everything that implies, well, my fear, of course, though, when I look at that, though, is that most designers don't go that much further. When you look at something like Musket and Pike and the effects of that, you can say, well, look, this guy knows what he's talking about, and he really spent the effort to get it nailed down over the years. Something like this, I get kind of the feeling that Mr. Berg has this general idea of how the combat works, an understanding of how the combat works in the era, does significant research on the battles, but obviously isn't nailing everything down the way that, who is it, Ben Hull with Musket and Pike, right, has done. It's not an act of absolute love and devotion. It's another interesting game by this designer, another interesting idea but maybe not a, you know, when you're trying to make a living off of making games, or part of your living, when you're trying to make that a significant part of your income flow, it doesn't make a lot of sense to really get things right, because you're not going to sell that many more. In fact, the large output that Berg makes may actually sell more of his games than the absolute nailing down of things that Ben Hull has done. But that's not to say I don't appreciate Mr. Berg's work. I really do. I think he does have a significant amount of insight, and he does put more work than I would into a game. But I also get this shaky feeling that there's enough wrong with this that it wasn't play tested out to the point where you could really say, all right, yeah, you know, these systems work as is. It's quite possible that these systems might not be even plausible. There might be no way to actually hammer them out to purely work. And again, this is just speculation, you know, across the board on things. TSS doesn't work either, and it's a classic, right? So, I mean, why does TSS not work? Well, because the numbers don't come out. You know, you look at the casualty numbers and you say, well, under normal players, they use their units way wrong. And it may be possible to get these battles under this system to work okay. But, and I'm not saying this one didn't. I'm just drawing a comparison between sort of my fake design that I'm throwing together and the holes that I see in the core of this game. And, you know, sometimes I think to myself, well, I could throw out a lot of half-baked ideas. They might not have the research behind them that this does, but here's the problem, or the point. It doesn't much matter if it doesn't really, really fit together and hold together under serious, sustained playtesting. It really doesn't. Maybe my little design attempts would be just as successful, at least for me. Another additional rule I'm going to throw into play. The broken side, the allies in this case, aren't going to be allowed to use the rally phase. I've got kind of a mixed feeling in that. But my feeling is that if a unit's not under command, it's not going to be able to rally. So basically, the commander has to choose to halt and do a rally action if he wants to rally his forces. Here's the mixed feelings. While I think it's perfectly accurate that the Allied army would continue routing in pieces, the problem is that units disintegrate more quickly if you end up rolling on the rout table, especially if their morale is bad, especially if they have that +1. So maybe I should allow that. Because it also slows down their routes, and it allows the units to stay more organized. So yeah, I think I am going to allow the rallies in there. They should cause as much pain as they do good. All right. But the enhanced morale penalty, an enforced rally might be more sensible. I'm actually rolling for every unit, and that's... I'm not sure if you're supposed to or not. It says attempt to rally by unit. I don't know if anywhere... Yeah, the rules that it drops you into gives a may, which I assume normally you don't have to choose it, and the French are choosing not to. It is a dangerous practice. You usually do... I've been doing it, and it's actually what caused a lot of the disintegration of the army. Not just routed units going off the board. Hey, you know, might as well take a chance on them. But disordered, if they're not near their command. But disordered units can sometimes, you know, disappear off of it. If you roll an 8 or higher, you're going to take a loss to your integrity of the unit, and that, you got 3 of them throughout the game for each unit. I think we're seeing something that's not too unreasonable looking here. Again, without really understanding what the casualty effects of a rout in this age are varied completely, but certainly Marlborough's win was heavily enhanced by the pursuit. I think this is feeling about right in terms of what we're seeing, the disintegration of the Allied army here. Now I could count points, but there's no real reason for that. I'm just more or less moving things to the dead pile, but I want to show what a turn's deaths mean. The French losses were some routed units that I had to try to save before they ran off the map. Didn't get to save them. It indicates a level of disorganization in the French army. If there's a significant amount of troops over here, what that really means is the French are going to have difficulty capitalizing on the victory. It's sort of like looking at the CWB loss charts and saying, yeah, this army is pretty close to wrecked. It's not going to be able to take advantage of this victory. The French army certainly has taken some losses. Given the time of the year, probably just like with Marlborough, they're not going to get any great advantage out of this victory on the strategic scale. But this would be an infamous loss, I think, for Marlborough. I get to move my commanders around. I haven't done that yet. I usually do that at the beginning of the turn just because it's easier for me. Alright, I think I'll do another turn. See how it plays out a little. Let's shoot our way through another turn. With so much of the day remaining, I'm probably not going to go through the whole thing. I just want to kind of get a feel for how my sort of ad hoc rules work. The problem is, so far they feel okay as I'm adding things and changing things and tweaking them, but they feel about as okay as the system does to me, which is maybe a highlight of my own lack of knowledge and ability to, really judge things, which is one of the problems. I can look at a game and I can say, this doesn't make sense, but I can't look at one and say, yeah, this really's got it usually. I don't know. That's why I criticize more than praise, because the truth of the matter is, on several levels, right? On the historical level, my knowledge, my understanding, and also my understanding of the game to the extent that I can operate the components correctly, that I can absorb the lessons to be learned from it, is fairly low. And likewise, on a similar basis, my likelihood to be able to determine from even extensive playing, and even when I play opposed, whether or not a game is terribly balanced is difficult. You can play... When I play something extensively, it means I play it, maybe when I was younger, several times a year, 3 or 4 times a year. As my collection grew, though, games, end up once a year, once every 2 years, whatever. So it's much, much harder to have a really good grasp on a game. Now, somebody who really, really studies a single game can probably give you a pretty good view on that. But most reviewers aren't going to do that. Most of us are looking at lots and lots of games of any type. It's very hard unless it happens to be a favorite, even of, somebody who's been in things for a long time, that they play fairly regularly. They're not probably going to be able to give the kind of insight into the game that a true fan will. And that's one of the things that I kind of always ask is, hey, it's not like a lot of people are going to be watching this at random, but, let's have some more coverage by the people who love a game. I'm beginning to see that with the OCS and with some other systems where people are really kind of pulling out a little bit more detailed discussions of systems, of games, etc., than someone like me who's a dilettante in everything. I mean, you know, I play all of these suckers. Okay. About half of them are fairly new to me, so I don't. But, you know, I've been playing about half this set on and off, different games, but never very seriously. So most games I'm not going to have a really good insight into. So, mainly all I can give you is what my impressions are after the few playings I've had over my life or with something like this in early play. And here I'm finding myself not thinking through the limb choices as well as perhaps I should. This is the hard decision. My first choice and the guaranteed one was, hey, I want to get the artillery moving. But the next one was I picked screening cav for the allies. The problem with that is my screening cav, it could launch attacks, and I'm fine with it doing that. You know, it's in command and such not. But that's not really my goal. My goal is to get off the board safely. And that screening cav is prevented from moving back because there's other units in the way. So they're possibly going to get isolated out there. On the other hand, if I pick the units that I'm running with, they'll move first. But then I don't have the ability, you know, to perform the orderly withdrawal that I want to with the screening forces. Troublesome seeing. I'm not sure how to apply this. You know, I feel like this may be an artifact of the chip pull system with my added. Blenville here was faced with a difficult decision. I have a couple of disordered units. I'd kind of like to rally them, but I also want the pursuit to be carried out. So I'm hitting some of Württemberg's infantry here, but his infantry's in pretty good order. There's no guarantee that I'm going to break it up, and I'm only hitting a couple of them. It's not like I'm swooping in with a widespread attack against everything. Only the Hussar, I think, is able to do anything like that, and only against actually routed units. I think I've got a pretty good feel for how the route's working. Pretty effectively. It is really destroying the army the way I'm doing it. It may actually be a little too powerful, a little bit too much. I've gotten 2 units off the board. We'd be going into this. 2 more turns of this. I don't see a point to doing it. It's basically a mechanical exercise, except for in a few places, and the choice of what limb you want to play. It's kind of interesting. I used to do things like this, games that were very much mechanical. You know what it reminds me of actually is Agincourt, where you have almost no choices at all in terms of what you're going to be able to do. You're just rolling dice, seeing what happens to all the units. It's almost a solitaire exercise, lacking completely in the game aspect to do that. Anyway, I hope you at least enjoyed the regular playthrough. This was, this was kind of intriguing to do. I'm not quite sure how I'd tweak those rules. And then, of course, if you were playing in some kind of campaign, how do you assess the losses? At what rate do they come back? Because they're not all casualties. Probably most people who are actually wounded are going to die. They've been left on the field unless they've got a minor flesh wound. But much of that is just unit cohesion breaking down. So if you were to use a system like this to try to generate what the pursuit would look like at the end of a battle in a campaign system like the Empires in Arms system, which uses Napoleon's battles for campaigns. I never tried it out that way, but you'd still have to do some abstract calculations based on what the losses were to figure out what the pursuit actually is. I think it is of interest, though, to see how devastating a particular pursuit would be. I'm not sure that this reflects that, but what I'm saying is if you were playing within that campaign type system, well, if you're playing out the battles, why not play out the pursuit as well? I don't know. because it's boring. Yeah, but it would at least give you a unified value of losses to attribute your casualty recovery at the end of the battle or whatever for. All right, this one's going up, and we'll do something else in between this and what's the next battle here? Ramillies.